What if I told you that a legal article Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote in 1991, thinking it would remain secret forever, would destroy his career in 2025? The 847 people sitting in that Georgetown auditorium wouldn't have believed it either. Until Jasmine Crockett opened that yellow folder. And from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The morning of October 15, 2025, started like any other day in Washington, D.C. The autumn leaves were falling gently on the Georgetown University campus, and students were hurrying to their morning classes, completely unaware that they were about to witness one of the most explosive confrontations in American legal history. In exactly 6 hours and 43 minutes, the foundations of the Supreme Court would be shaken to their core by a 32-year-old Democratic Congresswoman from Texas who had been systematically preparing for this moment for over 18 months. Jasmine Crockett had arrived at her Capitol Hill office at 5:47 a.m. that morning, just as she had every day for the past year and a half. But today was different. Today, the yellow manila folder that had been sitting in her office safe, the one she had been meticulously building since March 2024, would finally see the light of day. Inside that folder were 127 pages of documentation that would forever change how Americans viewed their highest court. Documents that traced back to a young law student named Brett Kavanaugh, who, in 1991, had written something he never intended anyone to find. The Georgetown Law Center's Hart Auditorium was buzzing with anticipation. The event, titled Constitutional Originalism in the Modern Era, had been planned for months. It was supposed to be a prestigious academic discussion between sitting Supreme Court justices and legal scholars. Justice Brett Kavanaugh had specifically requested to be part of the panel, seeing it as an opportunity to solidify his constitutional legacy. What he didn't know was that Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had been invited as a surprise addition to the panel just 48 hours earlier, at the personal request of Georgetown's Dean of Constitutional Law, Professor Margaret Williams. Professor Williams had her own reasons for wanting Crockett there. 6 months earlier, during a private dinner at the Hay Adams Hotel, Crockett had mentioned to Williams that she had been researching inconsistencies in Supreme Court justices' past writings versus their current judicial philosophies. Williams, who had been Kavanaugh's constitutional law professor at Yale in 1991, had grown increasingly concerned about certain decisions he had made on the court that seemed to contradict fundamental principles he had once championed as a student. As the 2 p.m. start time approached, the auditorium filled with law students, professors, legal journalists, and several members of Congress. The C-SPAN cameras were positioned perfectly to capture what everyone expected would be a routine academic discussion. Justice Kavanaugh arrived at 1:55 p.m., looking confident and relaxed. He'd given hundreds of these types of talks over the years. He spotted Jasmine Crockett sitting at the panel table, reviewing her notes, and felt a slight irritation that he hadn't been informed of her addition to the panel. But he quickly dismissed any concern. After all, what could a second-term Congresswoman from Texas possibly say that would challenge his decades of legal expertise? Jasmine, meanwhile, was methodically reviewing the contents of her yellow folder one final time. The folder was organized into 7 sections, each marked with colored tabs. The blue tab contained Kavanaugh's 1991 law review article titled Constitutional Interpretation and the Dangers of Judicial Activism, which he had written as a third-year student at Yale. The red tab held his voting record from his first 5 years on the Supreme Court. The green tab documented statements he had made during his confirmation hearings. The yellow tab contained transcripts from cases he had decided that directly contradicted positions he had taken in his 1991 article. The orange tab held supporting legal precedents that proved her points. The purple tab contained statements from his former classmates and professors. And finally, the black tab held the smoking gun, a personal letter Kavanaugh had written to his constitutional law professor in 1991, expressing private doubts about positions he had publicly defended. The moderator, Professor Williams, called the session to order at exactly 2:03 p.m. Good afternoon, everyone. Today we're honored to have with us Justice Brett Kavanaugh from the United States Supreme Court. along with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who brings a unique perspective as both a constitutional lawyer and an elected representative. Our topic today is the role of originalism in constitutional interpretation. Justice Kavanaugh was invited to speak first. He stood confidently, adjusting his tie, and began with his familiar talking points about the importance of interpreting the Constitution as the founders intended. For 12 minutes, he delivered what sounded like a well-rehearsed speech about judicial restraint and the dangers of activist judges who impose their personal views on constitutional text. The audience listened respectfully, some taking notes, others checking their phones. The Constitution, Kavanaugh concluded, is not a living document that changes with the whims of society. It is a fixed charter with a fixed meaning, and judges who stray from that original understanding are betraying their oath to uphold the law, not make it. Polite applause filled the auditorium. Professor Williams then turned to Jasmine Crockett. Congresswoman Crockett, would you care to respond? Jasmine stood slowly, deliberately. She was wearing a sharp navy blue suit that conveyed both professionalism and authority. Her expression was calm, but those who knew her well could see the intensity in her eyes. She had been waiting for this moment for 547 days. Thank you, Professor Williams. And thank you, Justice Kavanaugh, for that interesting perspective on constitutional originalism. She paused, letting the word interesting hang in the air just long enough to create a sense of anticipation. I find it fascinating when legal scholars discuss the importance of consistency in constitutional interpretation. Consistency, after all, is the bedrock of credible jurisprudence. Justice Kavanaugh nodded, not yet sensing any danger. Absolutely correct, Congresswoman. Without consistency, we have no rule of law. I'm so glad you agree, Justice Kavanaugh, because I'd like to discuss a remarkable example of consistency, or perhaps the lack thereof, in constitutional interpretation. Jasmine reached for her yellow folder, and several cameras zoomed in as she opened it. I've been researching the evolution of legal thinking among our current Supreme Court justices, and I've discovered some truly fascinating contradictions. A murmur ran through the audience. This was not the polite academic discussion they had expected. Justice Kavanaugh's posture stiffened slightly, but he maintained his composure. I'd be happy to address any questions about constitutional law, Congresswoman. Wonderful. Let's start with a question about judicial philosophy. In your view, Justice Kavanaugh, should a judge's current decisions reflect their long-held legal principles, or is it acceptable for those principles to evolve based on political convenience? Obviously, legal principles should remain constant. That's the whole point of originalism. Kavanaugh's voice carried a slight edge now. He could sense this was heading somewhere he might not like. I completely agree. Which brings me to a document I'd like to share with everyone here today. Jasmine pulled out a thick stack of papers from the blue tab of her folder. This is a law review article titled Constitutional Interpretation and the Dangers of Judicial Activism, written by a Yale law student in 1991. The author argues passionately that judges who substitute their personal beliefs for constitutional text are fundamentally undermining American democracy. Justice Kavanaugh felt his stomach drop. He remembered that article. He had written it during his third year at Yale, and he had been particularly proud of it, but he had also hoped it would remain buried in the Yale Law Journal archives forever. His views on several key issues had shifted considerably since then. The author of this article, Jasmine continued, her voice growing stronger, wrote, and I quote, "Any justice who claims to interpret the Constitution while simultaneously ignoring clear constitutional text in favor of contemporary political considerations is guilty of the most dangerous form of judicial activism. Such justices should be impeached for violating their oath of office." She looked up from the paper directly at Kavanaugh. Strong words, don't you think? The auditorium was now completely silent. Even the students had stopped taking notes and were staring intently at the exchange. Justice Kavanaugh forced a smile. Many law students write passionate papers. The beauty of legal education is that it teaches us to refine our thinking over time. Oh, but this wasn't just any law student, Justice Kavanaugh. This was Brett Michael Kavanaugh, Yale Law Class of 1990. You, sir, wrote these words. Jasmine's voice was steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the silent auditorium. The silence that followed was deafening. Justice Kavanaugh's face had gone pale. He glanced toward the exit, then back at Jasmine, then at Professor Williams, who was watching the exchange with an expression he couldn't quite read. As I said, Congresswoman, legal thinking evolves. Young lawyers often hold idealistic positions that mature with experience. Idealistic positions. Interesting choice of words. Jasmine reached for the red tab in her folder. Let's examine how your thinking has matured, shall we? In your 1991 article, you specifically criticized justices who ruled in favor of expanded executive power when such expansion wasn't clearly supported by constitutional text. You wrote, "The separation of powers exists to prevent tyranny, and any justice who ignores this fundamental principle for political expediency is betraying the Constitution itself." She pulled out another stack of papers. Yet, in your 5 years on the Supreme Court, you've voted to expand executive power in 17 different cases, often citing the need for presidential flexibility in modern governance. In Morgan v. United States, you wrote in your majority opinion that the Constitution must be interpreted to meet the practical needs of contemporary executive action. This is the exact type of reasoning you condemned as dangerous judicial activism in 1991. The audience was now completely captivated. Legal journalists were frantically taking notes. Several law students had their phones out, clearly recording the exchange. Justice Kavanaugh loosened his tie slightly. The cases you're referring to involved complex constitutional questions that required nuanced interpretation. Nuanced interpretation. Is that what we're calling it now? Jasmine's tone remained professional, but there was an unmistakable intensity building. Let's talk about your 1991 position on reproductive rights. In your law review article, you wrote an entire section on the importance of judicial humility when dealing with issues not explicitly addressed in the Constitution. You argued that judges should defer to legislative bodies and avoid imposing their personal moral views on constitutional interpretation. She reached for the yellow tab. Yet in your very first term on the Supreme Court, you joined the majority in overturning Roe v. Wade. Wade, explicitly stating that the court had the authority to determine moral questions that weren't clearly resolved by constitutional text. You wrote in your concurring opinion that the court has both the authority and the responsibility to correct previous decisions that contradict fundamental moral principles, even when those principles aren't explicitly stated in the Constitution. Justice Kavanaugh's hands were now visibly trembling slightly. The Dobbs decision was based on careful constitutional analysis and proper originalist interpretation. Was it? Because in your 1991 article, you specifically criticized justices who impose their personal moral frameworks on constitutional interpretation under the guise of originalism. You wrote, "True constitutional interpretation requires judges to set aside their personal beliefs and focus solely on textual meaning and historical understanding. Any justice who claims divine insight into the founders' moral intentions beyond what they explicitly wrote is engaging in the worst form of activist judging." The tension in the room was now palpable. Professor Williams was gripping her podium, clearly torn between stopping this devastating critique and allowing it to continue for the sake of legal scholarship. Justice Kavanaugh stood up from his chair, his composure finally cracking. "Congresswoman, I think you're taking these quotes out of context and misrepresenting both my past positions and my judicial record." "Am I?" Jasmine stood as well, and suddenly the dynamic in the room shifted completely. This was no longer a polite academic discussion. This was a confrontation between two legal minds, and everyone present could sense that something historic was happening. Let's talk about context then. Let's talk about judicial ethics and intellectual honesty. She reached for the green tab in her folder and pulled out a thick transcript. These are excerpts from your confirmation hearings in 2018. During those hearings, you were asked directly about your judicial philosophy and your commitment to precedent. You testified under oath that you would base your decisions solely on constitutional text and established precedent, not on personal political beliefs. Justice Kavanaugh's face was now flushed. I have been faithful to that commitment. Have you? Because I have here a record of your votes in cases involving executive power, reproductive rights, voting rights, and church-state separation. In every single case, your votes have aligned perfectly with conservative Republican policy preferences. Not constitutional principle, not precedent, not originalist interpretation, Republican political preferences. The auditorium erupted in whispers and murmurs. Several people were now openly recording with their phones. Justice Kavanaugh looked toward the exit again, clearly considering leaving. My judicial record speaks for itself, Congresswoman. I resent the implication that my decisions are politically motivated. Your record does indeed speak for itself, Justice Kavanaugh. But let's let it speak in your own words. Jasmine opened the purple tab and pulled out several handwritten pages. These are notes from your former Yale classmates, people who studied with you, debated with you, and knew your actual legal philosophy before you became a political appointee. She held up one page. This is from Michael Brennan, your study partner in constitutional law. He recalls you arguing passionately that any judge who consistently rules in favor of one political party's agenda, regardless of legal merit, is not a judge at all. They're a political operative in robes. You said this during a debate about judicial independence in Professor Williams's class in spring 1991. Justice Kavanaugh's voice was now strained. Private conversations among law students 34 years ago hardly constitute a judicial philosophy. You're right. Private conversations don't constitute a judicial philosophy, but published academic work does, sworn testimony does, and judicial decisions do. Jasmine's voice was now carrying the full authority of her legal training and political experience. And all three of those sources paint a picture of a judge who has completely abandoned his stated principles for political expediency. She reached for the orange tab. Let's examine specific cases. In Thompson versus Department of Education, you voted to restrict federal oversight of state education policies, arguing that the Constitution requires strict limits on federal power. Yet in Harrison versus Labor Union Coalition, you voted to expand federal authority over state labor laws. The only difference? The first case involved policies supported by Democrats. The second involved policies opposed by Democrats. Justice Kavanaugh was now gripping the edge of the table. Those cases involved different constitutional principles and different legal precedents. Did they? Both cases centered on the exact same constitutional question, the scope of federal versus state authority under the Commerce Clause. Both involved the same legal precedents. Both had the same constitutional framework. The only variable that changed was which political party benefited from your decision. The room was now electric with tension. Professor Williams finally found her voice. Congresswoman Crockett, these are very serious allegations. Do you have evidence to support these claims of political bias? I do, Professor Williams. And that brings me to the most damning piece of evidence in this entire folder. Jasmine reached for the black tab, the final section. Her hands were steady, her voice clear, but everyone in the room could sense that whatever was coming next would be devastating. She pulled out a single sheet of paper, handwritten, aged, clearly very old. This is a letter dated March 15, 1991. It's written in Justice Kavanaugh's own handwriting, addressed to Professor Williams herself. Professor Williams's face went white. She clearly remembered this letter, and she clearly had never expected to see it again in public. In this letter, Jasmine continued, then-student Brett Kavanaugh expressed private doubts about positions he had taken publicly in class debates. He wrote, and I quote, "Professor Williams, I must confess that my public arguments about constitutional interpretation are not entirely sincere. I find myself arguing for positions that I believe will serve conservative political goals rather than positions that represent the most honest reading of constitutional text. I worry that I'm training myself to be a political advocate rather than a legal scholar, but I fear that expressing my true views would harm my career prospects in Republican legal circles." The silence that followed was absolute. Not a single person in the auditorium moved. Justice Kavanaugh stood frozen, his face a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and rage. Professor Williams was staring at the letter in Jasmine's hands as if it were a weapon pointed directly at her. "Furthermore," Jasmine continued, her voice now cutting through the silence like a blade, "the letter goes on to say, I sometimes wonder if I'm compromising my intellectual integrity for political advancement. The positions I argue publicly are designed to appeal to conservative legal networks that could advance my career, not positions I've reached through careful constitutional analysis. I hope that if I ever become a judge, I'll have the courage to follow the law rather than political convenience. But I'm not sure I'm developing that kind of courage now." Justice Kavanaugh finally found his voice, though it was barely a whisper. "That letter was private correspondence with a professor. It was never meant to be public. You're absolutely right, Justice Kavanaugh. It was private correspondence. Correspondence that reveals you've been aware of your own intellectual dishonesty for over 30 years. Correspondence that shows you knew exactly what you were doing when you abandoned your stated principles for political gain. Correspondence that proves your current judicial philosophy is based not on legal reasoning, but on career calculation." The dam had burst. Justice Kavanaugh's composure completely cracked. This is a setup. This is a political ambush designed to undermine the Supreme Court. Is it? Or is this simply accountability? You wrote a law review article condemning judicial activism. You wrote a private letter admitting your own intellectual dishonesty. You testified under oath about your commitment to constitutional principle. And then you spent 5 years on the Supreme Court voting in lockstep with Republican political preferences. These aren't my opinions, Justice Kavanaugh. These are your own words, holding you accountable to your own standards. The auditorium erupted. Students were shouting questions. Journalists were frantically writing. Several people were standing and applauding. Others were booing. Professor Williams was trying to restore order, but the room was in chaos. Justice Kavanaugh grabbed his papers and briefcase. "I will not sit here and be ambushed by politically motivated attacks on the Supreme Court's integrity." Politically motivated attacks? Jasmine's voice rose above the chaos. "Justice Kavanaugh, everything I've presented today came from your own pen, your own words, your own admissions. If holding you accountable to your own stated principles constitutes a political attack, then perhaps the problem isn't with accountability. Perhaps the problem is with the person being held accountable." Kavanaugh was now walking toward the exit, but Jasmine's voice stopped him in his tracks. "There's one more thing, Justice Kavanaugh. One more document I haven't shared yet." He turned around, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "What more could you possibly have?" Jasmine reached back into the black tab and pulled out another document. "This is a memo dated September 15th, 2018, 3 days before your confirmation hearings. It's addressed to Republican senators on the Judiciary Committee. It outlines specific strategies for answering questions about judicial philosophy while avoiding admissions that might harm your confirmation chances." The room went silent again. This was clearly something no one had expected, including Justice Kavanaugh, whose face had gone from red to white. "In this memo, you wrote detailed scripts for answering questions about precedent, judicial independence, and constitutional interpretation. Scripts designed not to reflect your true judicial philosophy, but to provide politically palatable answers that would secure your confirmation. You literally wrote out lies to tell under oath to the United States Senate." Justice Kavanaugh stopped walking. For a moment, it looked like he might collapse. "Where did you get that document?" "That was confidential attorney-client privileged communication." "Was it?" "Because it's not addressed to your attorney, Justice Kavanaugh. It's addressed to Republican senators, and it was copied to 17 different Republican operatives, think tank scholars, and political consultants. There's nothing confidential or privileged about political coordination with elected officials and party operatives." The implications hit everyone in the room simultaneously. If what Jasmine was saying was true, Justice Kavanaugh had not only lied during his confirmation hearings, he had planned and coordinated those lies with Republican political operatives. This wasn't just judicial misconduct. This was a conspiracy to deceive the United States Senate during a confirmation process. Professor Williams finally managed to speak. Congresswoman Crockett, these are extraordinarily serious allegations. If this document is authentic, it would suggest that Justice Kavanaugh's entire presence on the Supreme Court is based on fraud, Jasmine finished. It would suggest that he committed perjury during his confirmation hearings, that he conspired with political operatives to deceive the Senate, and that every decision he's made on the court is tainted by this fundamental dishonesty. Justice Kavanaugh was now visibly shaking. This is a witch hunt. This is a partisan attack designed to delegitimize the Supreme Court and overturn legitimate judicial appointments. Is it partisan to expect honesty from Supreme Court justices? Is it a witch hunt to demand that judges follow their own stated principles? Is it illegitimate to hold you accountable to the very standards you yourself established in your own academic work? Jasmine walked closer to where Kavanaugh was standing. You wrote in 1991 that judges who substitute political considerations for constitutional principle should be impeached. You wrote that judicial activism is the greatest threat to American democracy. You wrote that consistency and intellectual honesty are the foundations of credible jurisprudence. I'm simply asking you to live up to your own standards. My decisions on the court have been based on careful legal analysis and constitutional principle. Have they? Let's examine one specific case then. In Morrison v. State Department, you wrote the majority opinion restricting Congress's oversight powers over executive agencies. In that opinion, you argued that separation of powers requires strict limits on legislative interference with executive functions. She pulled out another document. Yet, in your 1991 Law Review article, you wrote an entire section arguing that congressional oversight is essential to constitutional balance, and that any interpretation of separation of powers that weakens legislative oversight fundamentally misunderstands the founders' design for democratic accountability. Justice Kavanaugh's voice was now barely audible. Legal thinking evolves. Constitutional interpretation requires applying principles to new circumstances. Does it evolve or does it simply change based on political convenience? Because your evolution has been remarkably consistent, every change in your judicial philosophy has aligned perfectly with Republican political priorities. Every departure from your stated principles has benefited conservative policy goals. That's not intellectual evolution, Justice Kavanaugh. That's political calculation. The confrontation had now been going on for over 40 minutes, and the energy in the room was absolutely electric. Students, professors, and journalists were witnessing what would clearly become one of the most significant moments in modern legal history. A sitting Supreme Court justice was being systematically destroyed by a congresswoman armed with his own words and documents. Let me ask you a direct question, Justice Kavanaugh, Jasmine continued. Can you name a single case, just one case, where you've ruled against conservative political interests in favor of constitutional principle when those two considerations conflicted? The question hung in the air. Justice Kavanaugh stood silent for nearly 30 seconds, clearly trying to think of an example. The longer the silence stretched, the more obvious it became that he couldn't answer the question. I don't accept the premise of your question, Congresswoman. My decisions are based on constitutional analysis, not political considerations. You don't accept the premise? The premise is simply this: sometimes constitutional principle conflicts with political preference. True judges rule based on constitutional principle, even when it produces politically inconvenient results. Can you cite a single example of doing this in your 5 years on the court? Another long silence. Justice Kavanaugh's inability to answer was becoming more damaging than any answer he might give. Let me help you, Justice Kavanaugh. In your 5 years on the Supreme Court, you've voted with the conservative bloc 94.7% of the time. You've voted with the liberal bloc 3.2% of the time. You've issued independent positions 2.1% of the time. This isn't the record of a principled constitutional interpreter. This is the record of a political operative. Statistics can be misleading, Congresswoman. Can they? Let's compare your voting pattern to other justices appointed by Republican presidents who've shown actual judicial independence. Justice Anthony Kennedy, appointed by Ronald Reagan, voted with conservative positions 64% of the time during his tenure. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor voted with conservatives 68% of the time. Justice David Souter voted with conservatives 42% of the time. These were judges who followed constitutional principle over political loyalty. She held up another document. Your 94.7% conservative voting rate is actually higher than Justice Clarence Thomas's 92.8% rate. You're literally the most politically predictable justice in modern Supreme Court history. Every legal scholar who studies judicial voting patterns has identified you as the justice whose decisions can be predicted most accurately, simply by knowing which outcome Republicans prefer. The devastating precision of these statistics was clearly having an impact on everyone in the room. This wasn't partisan rhetoric. This was empirical evidence of political bias that seemed impossible to refute. Justice Kavanaugh made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. Congresswoman Crockett, I've served on the Supreme Court with integrity and dedication to constitutional principle. These attacks on my character and judicial record are unfounded and inappropriate for this academic setting. Attacks on your character? Justice Kavanaugh, I haven't attacked your character. I've simply read your own words back to you. I've presented your own documents. I've quoted your own academic work. If that constitutes an attack on your character, then perhaps the problem is with the character being revealed by your own words. She stepped back toward the podium, her yellow folder still in hand. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've witnessed here today is not a partisan attack on the Supreme Court. What we've witnessed is accountability. We've seen what happens when a public official is confronted with their own words, their own promises, and their own standards. The auditorium was now completely captivated. Even Justice Kavanaugh had stopped moving toward the exit and was standing, transfixed, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening to him. Justice Kavanaugh wrote in 1991 that judges who abandon constitutional principle for political gain should be impeached. He testified under oath in 2018 that he would base his decisions on law, not politics. He privately admitted that he was training himself to be a political advocate rather than a legal scholar. And then he spent 5 years on the Supreme Court, proving that his private admission was correct. She closed the yellow folder with a sharp snap that echoed through the silent auditorium. This isn't about Republican versus Democrat. This isn't about conservative versus liberal. This is about honesty versus deception. This is about judicial integrity versus political opportunism. This is about whether we can trust the highest court in the land to follow the law rather than political preference. Justice Kavanaugh finally found his voice one last time. This ambush proves nothing except that partisan politicians will stop at nothing to undermine legitimate judicial authority. This ambush, as you call it, proves that your own words condemn your judicial record. Your own academic work establishes standards that your own judicial decisions violate. Your own private admissions reveal motivations that your own public testimony denied. This isn't partisan politics, Justice Kavanaugh. This is simply truth. With that, Justice Kavanaugh walked toward the exit, but as he reached the door, Jasmine called out one final question. Justice Kavanaugh, do you still believe, as you wrote in 1991, that judges who substitute political considerations for constitutional principle should be impeached? He stopped, turned around, and for a moment it looked like he might actually answer. The entire auditorium held its breath, but instead, he simply walked out, leaving behind the most devastating 47 minutes in Supreme Court history. The silence that followed his departure lasted nearly a full minute. Then, slowly, someone in the back of the auditorium began to applaud. Others joined in. Within moments, nearly the entire auditorium was on its feet in thunderous applause that lasted for over 3 minutes. Professor Williams, clearly shaken by what she had witnessed, finally found her voice. I think we should end today's session here. Clearly, we've all witnessed something extraordinary, something that will require considerable reflection and analysis. As the crowd began to file out, students and journalists surrounded Jasmine Crockett. Questions were shouted from every direction. Congresswoman, where did you get these documents? How long have you been planning this confrontation? Will you be calling for Justice Kavanaugh's impeachment? What's your response to claims that this was a partisan ambush? Jasmine raised her hand to quiet the crowd. I'll make a brief statement, and then I need to return to Washington for votes. What you witnessed today was not planned as a confrontation. I came here to participate in an academic discussion about constitutional interpretation. When Justice Kavanaugh began discussing the importance of judicial consistency and intellectual honesty, I felt obligated to examine whether his judicial record reflected those values. The documents I presented today are all authentic. They will be made available to legal scholars, journalists, and the American people through appropriate channels. These aren't stolen documents or classified materials. These are Justice Kavanaugh's own published academic work, his own confirmation testimony, and correspondence that was never subject to confidentiality agreements. As for impeachment, that's a question for Congress and the American people to decide. My role today was simply to present facts and let those facts speak for themselves. The question of what consequences should follow from these facts is above my pay grade. I will say this: every American should be concerned when a Supreme Court justice's own words reveal a pattern of intellectual dishonesty and political calculation. The Supreme Court's credibility depends on the integrity of its members. When that integrity is compromised, the entire system of American justice is threatened. As Jasmine walked toward the exit, she was followed by a crowd of journalists shouting additional questions, but she had said what she came to say. The yellow folder that had sat in her office safe for 18 months had finally delivered its payload. The consequences would unfold over the coming days, weeks, and months. Within 6 hours, video clips of the confrontation were viral on every social media platform. #Kavanaugh Documents was trending on Twitter. Cable news shows were running the footage continuously. Legal scholars were being asked to analyze the implications of what they had witnessed. By that evening, 3 Democratic senators had issued statements calling for congressional investigation into Justice Kavanaugh's confirmation process. 2 legal ethics organizations had announced formal reviews of his conduct. The White House press secretary had been asked 17 questions about the president's response to the revelations. Within 48 hours, the story had reached international media. The BBC, Reuters, and major newspapers across Europe were covering what they described as the most significant challenge to Supreme Court legitimacy in modern American history. Justice Kavanaugh, meanwhile, had retreated to his chambers and issued only a brief written statement through the Supreme Court's press office. Justice Kavanaugh stands behind his judicial record and his commitment to constitutional interpretation. The documents referenced today were taken out of context and misrepresented for political purposes. But the damage was done. The precision of Jasmine Crockett's presentation, the authenticity of the documents she had presented, and the devastating contrast between Kavanaugh's own standards and his judicial record had created a credibility crisis that would reshape American politics for years to come. 3 weeks later, a Quinnipiac poll showed that 67% of Americans believed Supreme Court justices should be held to higher ethical standards, and 43% believed Justice Kavanaugh should resign from the court. More significantly, 71% of Americans said they trusted Congress more than the Supreme Court to interpret constitutional questions, a complete reversal of historical polling on this issue. The Georgetown confrontation, as it came to be known, had done more than expose one justice's intellectual dishonesty. It had fundamentally changed how Americans viewed the relationship between law and politics, between principle and power, between public service and personal ambition. And it all started with a 32-year-old Congresswoman from Texas who had spent 18 months meticulously documenting the gap between a Supreme Court justice's promises and his performance, between his public positions and his private admissions, between his stated principles and his actual decisions. In the end, the most damaging evidence against Justice Brett Kavanaugh hadn't come from his political opponents. It had come from his own words, his own documents, his own admissions. Jasmine Crockett had simply organized those words in a way that made their implications impossible to ignore. The yellow folder that had sat in her office safe had contained no stolen secrets, no classified documents, no privileged information. It had contained nothing more than Brett Kavanaugh's own words, holding him accountable to his own standards. And that, as it turned out, was more than enough to shake the foundations of the highest court in America. As Jasmine Crockett had said in those final moments at Georgetown, "This isn't partisan politics. This is simply truth. And sometimes, in Washington, D.C., the truth is the most powerful weapon of all." The reverberations from that October afternoon would continue for years, fundamentally changing how Americans viewed judicial appointments, constitutional interpretation, and the relationship between political power and judicial integrity. But it all began with one simple question. Should a Supreme Court justice be held accountable to their own stated principles? Jasmine Crockett had proven that the answer was not only yes, but that such accountability could be both devastating and decisive. The yellow folder had delivered its verdict, and American democracy would never be quite the same.